creatures are we? In every culture, in every age, we have always felt we were moral. But do our animal instincts and desires make that an illusion?
There was this obsession with competition and aggression and selfishness, and so our genes were selfish, we were selfish, and cooperation was a special case that we needed to explain, and we had a lot of trouble explaining it.
And yet every culture from the dawn of civilization has had a strong sense they knew what was right and what was wrong.
There's something about genuine moral truths which exerts a pull on us, which exerts a demand on us, whether we like it or not.
How do we explain such feelings? Is it possible that science can tell us what is and isn't moral? Or do moral truths lie outside of science?
There are many attempts nowadays to derive morality from science. Some are from evolutionary grounds, some are from neuroscience. They always introduce by the back door some concept of the good life which they take for granted without discussing, and they assume that's the right thing.
There's a fear of religion, and so some of the arguments for reductionism or the
Professor Ard Louis is a physicist at Oxford and also believes in God.
I am a scientist. I'm a physicist, and science is amazing. It'd be wonderful if it could explain what is right and what is wrong, but it just can't. I think it's really important to get away from this genes as blueprints metaphor. And if somebody wraps themselves in the mantle of science and tries to tell you what is right and what is wrong, then I think this is really dangerous for science and for society. That picture of a selfish gene is a very useful way of understanding something about the way nature works. But if you extrapolate it to all of biology, then you're missing the point.
David Malone has spent 20 years making science documentaries. He does not believe in God.
I think science does have insights about the roots of morality, but not the traditional selfish gene theory. I think science can begin to help us understand our better nature.
It's that, it gets away from the we are determined by our genes notion, doesn't it? Because it says you've got the genes.
In this third film of our series, David and Ard are trying to reconcile claims that science makes about our moral choices with what we feel we know about ourselves. For some scientists, like Peter Atkins, who believe that the only source of true knowledge is the study of the atoms and molecules of which we are made, the only possible source of morality is our genes.
Let's say I want to work out the value of a human being. Do I think David has some kind of intrinsic value so that I shouldn't kill him, for example?
Well, we're on the edge of understanding the scientific basis of morality and ethics at this point. And moral principles, in my view, emerge from two sources. One is our ethological history, our evolutionary history. And the second one is that we, with our big brains, can reflect in quiet moments, at least, on the consequences of our actions. So we're not just automata in terms of our evolutionary history. We are reflective human beings. I'm not going to kill you because you might have similar views about me. So let's compromise and not kill each other.
But why is that a scientific explanation?
Well, it's a way of looking for the roots of morality. And if the roots of morality are ultimately the stability of societies, then you have to explore using the scientific method, whatever that quite means, but in terms of evidence, looking at genetics, looking at histories, what ultimately leads to stable societies.
And that will give us a science of ethics.
Yeah.
So for you, that's going to be in the genes, ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah, ultimately in the gene, in the sense that we, with particular types of genes, for not killing each other.
Going to have to be built from what we know about altruism and genetics of altruism.
Yes, and morality, if you like, is the ultimate emergent property of the gene.
Okay. So isn't there a worry there that once I understand that this is the case, then I have this sense that I don't want to kill David because I feel it would be a bad thing to do. But once I realize that's just my genes or my history that's told me that, there's nothing more than that.
Well, there is more than that, because you know that he might be thinking the same to kill you.
That's right.
A society is a network of compromises, and we know that if we don't go around randomly killing, then we're more likely to survive.
So as long as David doesn't randomly kill and you don't randomly kill, I'm fine, but I could do whatever I like.
It sounds to me like civilization is a very large Mexican standoff.
Well, I'm afraid that's largely true. Isn't it? Yeah.
But can we really derive an objective science of morality from evolution? There are scientists who are deeply suspicious of the claim that any science can ever provide the basis for morality.
There are many attempts nowadays to derive morality from science. Some are from evolutionary grounds, some are from neuroscience and so on. They always introduce by the back door some concept of the good life which they take for granted without discussing, and they assume that's the right thing, and they then go on to talk about morality arriving out of evolution. Now, for instance, people try to say because it promotes people living together, it's good. Well, who said that people living together is good? It may be good for survival, but that's not the same as good in an ethical sense. I mean, just as an example, in a book called The Moral Molecule is based on the idea that a good life is a happy life. Well, if a good life is a happy life, we can solve it by giving everybody drugs and we'll all feel happy, and then is that a moral life? Of course it isn't.
So how should we understand the tension between our animal desires with our hopes of being moral creatures? Religion has traditionally told us we are divided creatures, made of a brutish animal nature that our God-given soul must struggle to control. How different is the modern scientific view? For all the talk of genes sounds new, the story is unchanged. Science has retained the divided view of us. Only now, in place of the soul, we have the rational mind. In place of brutish nature, we talk of selfish genes. The terms have changed, but the dismal view has survived.
The philosophers did that. They said, well, religion, let's move that to the side, and we philosophers, we will propose rationality as an explanation of human morality. Yeah, that's a very dangerous idea, because it basically says that deep down we are bad, and with a lot of struggle we can be good, but as soon as something happens, it disappears. Yeah. It's a very pessimistic view of human nature. But there has been proposals that science is going to solve the moral issue. Science is going to tell us what is moral and immoral.
And what do you think about that?
I would never trust scientists to tell me what is moral or immoral.
Okay.
Because they're a bit like philosophers. They're sort of narrow in how they look at things. That's Azalea. So yeah, all the chimps have names, and we follow them for many years, some of them for 20 years or longer. They're all used in behavioral studies.
For modern science, the roots of human moral behavior have to lie in the evolved behaviors we share with our closest relatives. But for Frans de Waal, who has spent 30 years studying chimpanzees' social and moral behavior, science is now revealing a far more positive side to chimpanzee and human nature.
Sometimes people think that our kind of instincts that we have are dangerous ones, you know, where nature is red in tooth and claw.
Yeah, that's a view of nature that I don't hold necessarily. To use nature only for the negative side of human nature, so like when we're killing each other, we say we're acting like animals.
Yeah, exactly.
And so all the nasty things that we do and the selfish things, I've called that veneer theory. It's
Okay.
like, is that all the basic emotions of humans are bad, and then there's a little veneer of morality that we achieve culturally or religiously or whatever. And actually, interestingly enough, that whole literature on selfish genes and how we humans are overly competitive and just like the rest of the animal kingdom, that was all a literature about psychopaths, I think. It was basically describing the human species as a psychopath. All we can think about is what is good for me, and very reluctantly thinking about what is good for you. And so that view of the human, which was popular in the 70s and 80s, after all, there was this biologist who said, scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. That was a very popular thing and basically describes a psychopath. And everyone was happy with that at the time.
And the idea would be that if somebody shows behavior that looks like something good, fundamentally they're doing it for selfish reasons.
Yeah,
so
of
you
course.
scratch them and they're really hypocrites.
Yeah, there cannot be genuine altruism, there cannot be genuine kindness, because there's always a selfish agenda behind it. And so I don't buy into that at all. I think humans have all these tendencies. We have good tendencies and bad ones. And they're all connected to our human nature and our primate nature. And you can recognize all of that in the chimpanzee as well.
For Jane Goodall, this broader view of our primate nature was already clear. Perhaps because rather than look at them through the lens of a predetermined scientific theory, she chose to live with them in their world.
When I got to Cambridge to do a PhD, I hadn't been to university at all.
Okay.
And I was pretty scared, you know.
Yeah.
Got there and was told by these erudite professors I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. Some
Really?
of them said it's scientific to give them numbers. And I couldn't talk about personality, mind capable of thinking, and certainly not emotions, because those were unique to humans. And at that time, we're going back now to 61, it was still believed by mainstream science that there was a difference of kind between us and the rest of the animals.
What they were telling you, you had to be a spectator, an outsider, and not be involved.
Not be involved emotionally at all.
That distance would have prevented people from seeing what was true.
Yes, of course.
For Professor Louis, as a child, there was no such distance.
I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa, and my parents are biologists. We lived in the jungle, and the local hunters had shot a chimpanzee without realizing that it had a little baby, a few weeks old, still clinging to its mother. And so we raised it with a bottle that was at home. His name is Bertje. Here's a picture of us in the back garden.
You and Betja.
Bertje, yeah.
Betja.
I think he's about 2 and I'm about 4 or maybe 3. So my mother says, although we look differently, we behave remarkably similarly. You know, in the morning we fed him porridge and he'd eat with a spoon,
Yes.
which he didn't actually really like. So if you turned around, he would eat with his hands. And then when you look back, he'd grab a spoon as if, of course, I've been eating with my spoon the entire time.
That's quite clever, isn't
It's
it?
really clever, yeah. So he had a real kind of, he knew what was going on, he could sense things. And I felt very attached to him. I really thought he was like a brother. And we played, and you know, he was very, he liked to play hide and seek. And here he is with my sister. He and my sister were exactly the same age. And they had a very close bond that I was actually a little jealous of. It was we had some pet goats that also ran around the area. And one day, one of these little goats was wandering close to him, and he jumped out and grabbed it, ran up into the tree, and just wrung its neck and killed it. And then he started poking out his eyeballs, and it was cruel. It was mean. I remember looking at that and thinking, that's bad. That's evil. And later I've thought about it. It's like, well, was he morally responsible for that kind of gratuitous killing?
For him, it was just sort of curiosity and what is this creature. I used to think they were like us but nicer.
Yeah.
And then I realized that just like us, they have this terrible dark streak.
But you would say they're not morally responsible for that behavior, even though
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
I don't think chimpanzees, or probably any animal, is capable of torture, which I would define as premeditated, planned intention to inflict pain, mental or physical.
Yeah.
That's torture, and that's evil.
So when Bertje showed real, what I would consider loving behavior, and he would hug you and be very affectionate.
Loving.
Yeah, very loving.
But then what happened to him?
Well, so he eventually he lived with us for a few years, and then when he was about 5 years old, we brought him to a nature reserve, where they tried to bring him back into the wild. So, but unfortunately, he got ill at some point, and
This is the tragedy of these humanized chimps. They can almost never be reintroduced.
Okay.
No, unless they're with a whole group.
Unless they're brought in as a group.
Yes.
So what should we have done then? Because he was a few weeks old, and he would have
Yeah,
died.
well, no, you did the right thing. You took him and you looked after him.
Yeah.
Young ones can actually die of grief if
Really?
if they lose their mother. Even at 8 years old, we had one.
Just of
Then-
grief, just being sad.
It was just depression. Depression.
We'd call that a broken heart if it happened in humans, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
I wonder if that's what happened to Bertje when he.
It could well be. I mean, he lost his whole family. Yeah. He was abandoned.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man.
That's the trouble.
Yeah.
And
That's really tough. I hadn't
we
thought of that.
interfere
Yeah.
in animals' lives, but we interfere in each other's lives too.
Yeah. Wow.
But yeah, you were his family.
Yeah, and we left him behind. I felt abandoned when he left him, but I never, until today, thought that might have happened to him. Maybe he died of grief.
They get the immune system weakened in that depressed state, same as with us.
Yeah.
Died of a broken heart. There's nothing else you can say really.
It's really sad.
There are a lot of sad
You're right.
things.
Yeah. I really loved Bertje. It was like a brother, and
Well, this is the thing. They are so human.
Yeah, they're so human.
According to evolutionary theory, natural selection should always favour those who are selfish over those who are generous. Those who cooperate should always be cheated by those who defect from the social contract. Yet life stubbornly tells us this isn't always true.
Now we realize that cooperation is abundant in nature and it's kind of needed to explain complex life. So we have to ask the question, why is it that sometimes natural selection favors cooperation?
Yes, because the simple view of natural selection would be
If
that it can't.
That is where the mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation come into play, such that natural selection sees the advantage of cooperation, favors cooperators over defectors.
What Martin Novak did was create a computer model showing the evolution of cooperation versus cheating and defecting.
So here we have a sea of cooperators in blue and a single defector.
Tell me what you mean by cooperator and defector.
The defector is selfish and the cooperator does something very strange because
generous.
the cooperator, generous, but kind of generous to a competitor, because everybody here is a competitor with everybody else, and the cooperator helps a competitor. It reduces its own potential in order to augment the potential of somebody else.
Which you wouldn't expect natural selection to allow.
Yes, natural selection should basically make sure that those cooperators who do this strange thing, they get wiped out.
So what happens?
Yeah, let us start the game. See, yes, these defectors, they are spreading. So the colors that we're observing here is red are defectors,
The
Blue
cheaters.
are the cooperators. Yes, the cheaters. Red are cheaters, and blue are the cooperators, the good guys. And then we have these two other colors here, and that is green and yellow. And green are new cooperators in every round, and yellow are new defectors in every round.
How do they manage to survive?
They are like in the fabric sort of our universe. We have these cooperators, and they survive because they form these clusters.
Natural selection would say the cooperators would get wiped out, and yet it's not happening.
Yes.
So why?
The reason why cooperators are not wiped off the board is because they form clusters.
Okay.
And in such clusters, a cooperator is surrounded by other cooperators. And in those clusters of cooperators, they actually get a high payoff.
So they do better.
They do better than the defectors that are surrounded by other defectors. So we always have to ask, on the edge between a cooperator and a defector cluster, who is actually winning? Because the cooperator, even though sitting on the edge, is still getting all the help from other cooperators inside, but the defector is sort of getting no help from his defectors.
So this is a bit like if I'm with my neighbors and we help each other, then we'll be better off than the neighbors one block down who don't help one another.
Yes, that's right.
But the main argument is people used to think that the defectors or the cheaters, in standard evolutionary theory, they always win.
Yes, that's exactly right. So natural selection favors defectors, and therefore defectors would be expected to wipe off cooperators off the board. Competition and cooperation is totally locked together, yes, intertwined.
If Martin Novak is right, then mathematical theory shows that evolution depends not just on competition, but on cooperation as well. The two locked together.
So Art, if you could take one thing away from the Novak interview, what would it be?
Well, I think it's the idea that cooperation is somehow built into the structure of the universe. That's really interesting if it's true.
Do you think it is?
I think so, yeah. I think he's making a pretty good stab at showing that somehow it emerges from the basic laws of nature. That's surprising.
Martin Novak's work finally demonstrated that evolutionary theory can account for the cooperative behavior that experimenters have been observing for decades.
We give them sometimes more food or food that is more monopolizable, like a watermelon, and then you can see the food sharing between them. I would say most animals cannot survive without cooperation. So the level of cooperation is all sorts of different levels, but it's everywhere.
It is 80 years since experimenters clearly showed how chimps were capable of setting competition aside in order to cooperate and pull a box containing food that was too heavy for any of them individually.
Why do you think we haven't seen it before?
I think after World War II there was this obsession with competition and aggression and selfishness, and that lasted until the 1980s or so. So our genes were selfish, we were selfish, and cooperation was a special case that we needed to explain. And we had a lot of trouble explaining it. We recently set it up in our group of chimps, where instead of just having 2 chimps, we used 15 chimps. So now you have the potential of competition. But everyone is present, and so the highest ranking members of the group, they can kick you away, or they can steal your food, or someone can sit next to you and try to steal your food. And so we wanted to see, how do the chimps handle this situation? Now, if competition is stronger as an instinct, so to speak, than cooperation, it would all fall apart and there would be bickering and fighting. But actually they were cooperating all the time, and they handled the competition very well. They were very good at either alternating positions or getting rid of freeloaders or not working with someone who's too competitive so that he learns to become cooperative.
Not only can chimps and monkeys cooperate like us, but Professor de Waal found they shared a strong sense of fairness as well.
We set up an experiment with capuchin monkeys where one of them gets cucumber for a task, the other one gets grapes for a task. If they both get cucumber, they're perfectly fine, and they do it many times in a row. If they both get grapes, also perfectly fine. But if you give the partner grapes, and grapes are 10 times better than cucumber, then the one who gets the cucumber still is going to refuse. And not only is he going to refuse, he's going to get agitated, and he's going to shake the cage, and he's going to throw the cucumber out, which is irrational, because the cucumber was good before. Why is it not good anymore? So we set up this experiment. Then a philosopher wrote us that it's impossible for monkeys to have a sense of fairness, because fairness was discovered during the French Revolution. Basically, that tells us morality comes from a bunch of old guys in Paris who sit around and say, well, fairness would be a good idea, you know.
And everyone else in the world went, oh my God, what a good idea.
Yeah, let's spread the word on fairness. It's a good thing, you know. And so that's how they think we arrive through reasoning and logic at a point where we say fairness is a good thing, and then we implement it in society. But it is completely the other way around. Young children, 2-year-old children, already have a sense of fairness, just like my monkeys do. And so it's an emotional process. You compare what you get with what somebody else gets.
I was wondering, in that experiment, did the monkey who's getting the cucumber sometimes just look at the one with the grapes and say, hey?
No, that's chimpanzees will do that.
Really?
The monkeys have a sense of fairness that is at the level of a 2 or 3-year-old child. But the chimpanzees, yes, in chimpanzees you may have a situation that the one who gets the grape will refuse the grape till the other one also gets a grape.
That's terribly sophisticated behavior.
Yeah, but they do that in the field also.
30 years of careful observation has convinced Professor Duval that the foundation of human morality is the empathy and fairness we share with chimpanzees and other primates.
It used to be thought 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that empathy is a sort of decision. I decide to be empathic with you, or I decide to put myself in your shoes. That's not how it works at all. It's an automated process that is a very biased process in addition. I look at morality as a bottom-up system in the sense that it's built on foundations of human, primate, social tendencies. But then what we humans do is we try to translate that into justifications and in principles, and we come up with a narrative. But then we take it one step further, which is an intellectual step, really. It's more like a cognitive step. And that's maybe why I don't see any of that in my primates.
For much of human history, that intellectual step, as far as morality is concerned, has been shaped by religious belief.
So here's a question for you all. If you think that God put certain moral truths in the universe, the absolute ones, do you think chimpanzees would be able to see them dimly?
That's really interesting. I've never thought about that before.
Because I mean, if they're there, then don't you think the chimpanzee should see them, albeit dimly, like monuments on the horizon?
Horizon, yeah. That's a very interesting question I hadn't thought about. I mean, religion is kind of silent on that, animals in this sense. So I can't really get any guidance from there.
Well, as a scientist then?
As a scientist, yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting questions is how different are we from animals, right? So we're clearly different, but is it a difference of degree, or really a difference of kind?
But if it's an evolved thing, then just like they can solve problems, but not as well as us.
Yeah. That's right. So
might they have they're dimly seeing these moral truths.
So I think God used the evolutionary process to make us who we are. And so why would that not include animals also understanding something about...
It's a weird thought, isn't it?
It's a weird thought, yeah, exactly. I never thought about that before. That's kind of cool.
I think it is. Yeah.
There is a gulf between chimpanzees and us. An intellectual and moral threshold we crossed and they didn't.
Did you ever see chimpanzees doing some kind of maybe religious type behavior or dances? Or
Let's say pre-religious. So we
Pre-religious,
have
okay.
this amazing waterfall at Combi.
Okay.
You can hear it roaring. It falls down 80 feet, and there's a thundering noise as this rather narrow stream lands in the rocks below. And the chimpanzees sometimes do these amazing, like 20-minute displays. I call it a waterfall dance. More scientific to call it a display, but they are upright and they're swaying from foot to foot. They pick up big rocks in the stream and hurl them.
Wow.
Then the time I remember vividly was when I actually was able to see the eyes of this male, and he'd finished his display, his dance, and he was sitting on a rock, and I was watching his eyes, and he was watching the water falling, and he was watching the water flowing away, and I thought to myself, you know, this pinpoints the biggest difference between them and us, that what is this? What is this stuff that's always coming and always going and it's always here? Might not that lead to some primitive early religion worship of the elements, early man's curiosity as to what these things are and what they meant? But we can discuss it.
Yeah.
Therefore, we could turn it into that early primitive religion. The chimpanzee has the same, perhaps, feelings, although we don't know, but that he can't discuss.
Yeah.
So although their brain cognitively is capable of, they can learn sign language, they can learn up to 600 signs or more, they can use a computer, they can paint, they can tell you what they've painted, they have a sense of humor, but as far as we know, they can't discuss something.
Yeah. So it's almost as if they're on the cusp of that. They might have intimations of something, but it's just out of reach for them.
And these guys, like Betty, they become different because they're with us, because they're in a different type of society where we do use language all the time.
Once humans had evolved the intellectual ability to know and talk about what was good and what was bad, we began to worry why it was we sometimes chose to do bad.
The Milgram experiments were conducted shortly after World War II, and I think the sentiment at the time was trying to figure out how on earth did the Holocaust happen.
And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn.
Milgram's experiments were really going after the idea that people are willing to do atrocious things when they are persuaded to do so by authority.
I'm up to 180 volts. Please continue, teacher.
You can draw many different conclusions from this. One conclusion you can draw is the majority of people are willing to shock a stranger to death, right?
That was what was picked up at the time, isn't it?
That was what was picked up at the time.
Oh, man. Continue, please.
Majority of participants in that experiment voiced some protest at some point. They were deeply uncomfortable with the situation.
Go on with the procedure, please, teacher. 315 volts. The answer is ink.
They were sweating, heart racing, very distressed, and asked to stop many times. And the experimenter would say things like, "You must go on. The experiment requires that you go on." The experimenter had to persuade the participants to carry on with the experiment.
I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Well, now, given the work that we've done, what I see in it is the distress that people were feeling and really found it quite aversive to harm this other person.
It's an illustration of how hard you have to work to overcome.
Exactly.
Was it their empathy, do you think?
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to assign you to the roles of decider and receiver.
Dr. Crockett's own experiments have looked further into how people make moral decisions and how those decisions can be influenced.
So our work is really focused around a central question, which is how do we value the welfare of other people and the values that people place on the other person's welfare and what they're willing to sacrifice to preserve that welfare.
Time to put my own moral fibre to the test.
Okay, so you've been assigned to the role of decider, which means that Ard is the role of receiver.
I'm just going to stick these on now.
So how many shocks would I be willing to give Ard for the money they offer me?
What we've shown is that we have to pay people more to deliver shocks to the other guy than to deliver shocks to themselves.
That's reassuring.
It is reassuring. Yeah.
Okay.
So as the decider, you'll make a series of decisions. Most decisions involve choosing between a smaller amount of money plus a smaller number of shocks versus a larger amount of money plus a larger number of shocks.
Okay.
Slightly worrying. What's going to happen?
Don't worry, nothing's going to happen. I'll always tell you when you're going to get shocked, don't worry.
S for start.
I would expect very different psychological processes to be involved in decisions to harm someone you have a working relationship with.
That is a lot of shocks, though, isn't it?
I don't know if you have any pre-existing grudges.
I don't think Ard's going to speak to me after this.
The essence of Dr. Crockett's experiment is to see if David will be more willing to accept higher payments for giving shocks to Ard or to himself.
I've lost track completely of how many shocks I've lined up for poor old Ard.
Mm-hmm. Come in.
Hello.
Hi.
I have some unfortunate news for you.
Which is what?
You're going to receive some shocks.
Oh.
So if you could go sit there and I will get it set up.
Okay.
David, do you think you would have made different decisions if it weren't Ard in the receiver position, but if it were a stranger?
How? How long is this going to go on? Ouch.
I think I might have been nice to a stranger because would have had no relationship with them. And they might have been a little old lady or something. But with Ard, it's just a bit of fun. If he gets 20 shocks, he'll come out here and hit me, and that'll be fun.
All right, finished.
Hello, my friend, how are you? Sorry. In your work, you speak about certainty and uncertainty in moral decision making. Do you want to explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so earlier when you guys were in the lab and David, you were making decisions about Ard and pain for him. You know, when I asked you afterwards what you thought about those decisions, you sort of thought, oh, well, I thought he could take it. And then I asked you, well, if it had been a stranger, how would you have chosen? And what you said is very much in line with the way we've been thinking about it. You said, well, you know, I wouldn't know who the person was. I wouldn't know anything about them. What if it was an old lady? And at the end of the day, we can't get inside another person's head, right? And so when we make a decision that's going to affect someone else, there is an element of uncertainty that can never be satisfactorily resolved. And I think that the more uncertainty there is, the more cautious we are when we're dealing with other people, because we don't want to put someone in a bad way. And there's a sense of risk associated with making an assumption about someone that could be wrong.
That's fantastic, because that runs completely counter to the old arguments about altruism, where you'll only actually care about the people you're related to, those
exactly.
nearest and dearest to you, and this is running completely counter to it.
Yeah, well, it does set up some unusual predictions.
I can see David is really pleased that science now does see the good in us. But the thing for me is the fact that we have good instincts, like cooperation, is not really the point. I mean, the ultimate example of cooperation is an army at war. Let's say that I watch a man throw a rock, okay? And I ask myself, what can I explain from science about the throwing of that rock? Well, I can explain the trajectory of the rock by laws of physics, how hard he throws it by the laws of biomechanics. I could even use neurophysiology to work out how the signals went into his arm and back to throw the rock.
You can see which bits of his brain
light up. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. But there's another level, which is, should he have thrown the rock? As he throws a rock at you, right? Was that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? That's a really important question, but science doesn't tell me whether he should or shouldn't have thrown the rock. right? And so I think it doesn't really matter to me whether I can describe by the laws of physics everything about
just
him.
the how. The how
Everything
we know
about how he threw the rock,
Yeah,
right?
you want to know why.
I want to know why he threw the rock, and I want to know, should he have thrown the rock, right? Or should he not have thrown the rock?
For religious people, like Ard and John Cottingham, the question remains, can there ever be a scientific answer to what we ought to do and what obliges us to do it?
Can the truths of morality, for example, that compassion is required of us, that cruelty is wrong, can those be reduced to or explained in terms of the laws of physics? Pretty clearly not. Can they then be explained in terms perhaps of biological drives? Well, again, I think not, because there's something about genuine moral truth which exerts a pull on us, which exerts a demand on us, whether we like it or not, almost irrespective of how we feel, what we would like to do. Now, either you explain those away as illusory in some way, or you have to acknowledge there's a part of reality which isn't just configurations of particles interacting.
So someone might say that, we could explain these moral sense we have, even the feeling of being compelled on maybe an evolutionary ground. So we've evolved this way because it makes us better at cooperating or better at surviving, really.
If you take a kind of biological view, as you were suggesting, then it so happens that we've evolved certain inclinations. But had our history, our social or biological history, gone slightly differently, we would have different ones. So compassion might not be right. Cruelty might not be wrong if had things gone a bit different. Now that seems strong, at least to me, seems strongly counterintuitive.
Are you sort of saying that there is a moral compass?
Precisely.
Okay.
So even if I inclined to be cruel or inclined to be destructive or selfish, I'm, as it were, pulled. I think the compass analogy is a very good one. I'm not, of course, forced, because we often do turn away from the good, unfortunately.
But you know it's there.
But we know it's there. There's an analogy, I think, here with mathematical reasoning, that we often do go wrong. We often make mistakes, but we have a strong sense that there is something that's the right answer in principle, and that our reasoning, however faulty and shoddy, ought to be conforming to that. And I think it's exactly the same in morality.
If morals are merely evolved sentiments or just cultural preferences, then they have no ultimate binding authority. For morals to have any real authority, they have to have a much firmer foundation. Perhaps something placed in the universe by God. So how about people who say, well, these things are just socially constructed? Right?
Then you're back with that problem of, had society developed slightly differently, we'd have to say then cruelty might not be wrong. Oppressing the weak might be good. And that just sounds wrong, doesn't it? I mean,
You're suggesting that maybe moral truths are woven into the fabric of the universe like mathematical ones?
Well, I think I would say that. That's to say, there's something in the nature of reality which makes these truths necessary. Not, of course, in exactly the same sense as logic and mathematics, but I would say that they are like boundary stones which our thought can overflow but not shift. So in the same way, I think the moral truths come pretty near to being necessarily true. And then you have to ask what makes them true. You could just say, well, they're just true and nothing makes them true. If you don't go that route, I think I'm certainly drawn to saying there's something they're somehow grounded in the way the cosmos is. And that leads to a more religious interpretation, perhaps.
Whereas David doesn't believe in God, but he does want to hold on to there being moral truths that are independent of ourselves.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I do have the sense that there are things which were true before we imagined them.
So then I don't think you have that many options in describing or accounting.
You're ganging up on me, aren't you?
It's just that either you've got to say, well, they seem like impressive, authoritative requirements, but really they're just disguised preferences, something like that. Or you have to say they're just wafting around in some abstract realm.
I'm guessing you don't like that, the wafting around
well,
option.
I think you like wafting.
No, that's not fair, I don't.
Or they are grounded in some ultimate reality. And that's
Or those are my only choices. Because none of those three options seem terribly appealing. I don't know, I mean...
That's interesting. I think
I don't know yet.